As Marla's mentioned, and as Kate also has just mentioned, yes, Marla and I go back a long way. I think it's almost 25 years, honey. So a really long time of collaboration and working on some really amazing projects together. Marla has presented us a really wonderful overview and an important recap of Sydney's recent urban development, I think, and the way the metropolitan area has shifted and changed over the last 40 or 50 years, and in particular, how art and the creative arts have been able to participate in that development to catalyze some very important aspects of cultural development as well, to engage communities and to help new residents in new parts of the city engage with their landscape and understand it. She started out by reminding us of the failure of some of the master planning that took place, particularly in Western Sydney, and the inability to really forecast how those cities and suburbs were going to evolve, and the expectation that it would be more people like us just moving out there and enjoying life in this new landscape in these great new places. But in fact, that has not been the case in many of the suburbs, and so the redevelopment of some of those early experiments of the 1970s has been going on and continues on in that part of the world. I think it's important for us to focus on the outer suburbs of Sydney. And it's really been rich to see how the cultural projects that Marla has talked about really work to help new residents not only acculturate to a new physical environment, but also a new social environment. These are complicated narratives, as she has talked about, and the role of artists working with community to help bring out those stories has been very important and very central to that acculturation. I think the notion of the aspirational suburbs in a more contemporary sense is an important one for us to keep focused on as well. And the potentially, well, she started to note in the early 90s how there was a presentation of the potentially positive aspects of suburban life, and that cultural planning, in fact, had a lot to do with helping people express that sense of optimism. That came along with new methodologies of engagement with community, and I think if we looked back at planning education, planning pedagogy in that time, we would also start to see some of those ideas introduced to community engagement and the way we were starting to work with our students in becoming more involved in working with community in that way. So the connection not only with a new social community, but also a connection with a new landscape. And as a landscape architect, that aspect of suburban development in this part of Sydney has been very central to a lot of my work as a practitioner and more recently as an academic. I loved the reminder of the 1990s and artists in Western Sydney and the art scene there coming of age, and Western Sydney artists really being recognized as a distinctive voice in their own right, talking about their lived reality of that part of the world, and not just talking about it, but displaying it in the work that they were doing. And not only displaying it for themselves and expressing themselves, but also putting that in front of other people and saying this is our reality of this part of the world. There was a shift also, I think, at that point in time in terms of the notion of renewal as a social process, a cultural process, as well as a physical process. And for those of us in architecture planning, landscape architecture, it's a lot about the physical realities of the projects that we're involved with, that we design and implement. But in fact, underpinning this, importantly, was the cultural and social processes going on as well. Happily, I think what's going on now in the development of many of these new estates in Western Sydney is a focus on the shared public domain and landscape development, the expressions of common experience and shared values playing out in those places that we share. And so the image of the mothers with children coming from many parts of the city to Potts Hill to experience a new public space is also testament to the power of social media, because those women are on their phones saying, get out here, this is the place, this is a great place to meet, let's have our play group meeting out here this week. And so I think those sorts of dimensions of how technology also feed on that are really powerful. So, of course, increased funding and focus on public domain is great for landscape architects, but in particular, I think landscape architects have taken the lead in collaborating with public artists and art facilitators such as Marla. And it's important that we recognize that happen throughout a project, and as landscape architects always want to remind developers, it's not something that you think of at the end, it's something that needs to be thought of right up front, and that particularly goes with the engagement of community and with the way we operate in planning these spaces ahead of time. For practitioners, there are diverse demands on shared public space, and I think some of the examples that Marla showed are places for play, they're places for learning, they're places for recreation. They're also fundamentally underpinned as ecological systems, and so again, we're dealing with a very complex set of factors that we have to juggle when we're developing these areas. How do we engage and meet with the needs of everybody that's going to be coming here to visit the place and use it, as well as its residents? And the landscape heritage is equally important to consider as the built heritage, and I think that's another dimension of it that we think about in these projects. Finally, the note about young people engaging with cultural expression to understand their new shared public landscapes is an important area for us to be working in, to help these young people develop a sense of connection and identity with their new places of residence and new landscapes. And I loved the final comments you made, Marla, about the suburbs are the studio in which intercultural narratives will develop. And we will certainly use those in our work, in our practice, but we'll also be using those in our studios with students and in the research work that we undertake as well. And I think that's a beautiful metaphor for thinking about how we regard these places in our own work going forward. So thank you very much, Marla, for that presentation. I will leave it to the floor to actually introduce first questions.